Hi everyone, welcome back to lecture. So, we have been talking about the formation of American government, and as we discovered last time, the first system, the Articles of Confederation, came with some problems. In the effort to avoid being like the British and having too much order, we created a very, very weak system of government under the Articles. And that weak system then made it very difficult to respond to the challenges after the American Revolution. And so while we had the one success with the Northwest Ordinance and kind of the path to statehood going forward, we also had problems dealing with the national economy in terms of debt and the way inflation is rising. We also had problems dealing with other entities, whether these were Native American tribes who were resisting American expansion into the West, or we're talking about nations like Spain and Great Britain who are kind of demonstrating that they are more powerful and they are doing things to kind of hurt the American expansion, either westward because of lack of access to things like New Orleans, or because they're standing in direct opposition to previous promises like the British with those forts. And so we weren't able to address the needs of the nation. When we get to things like Shays' Rebellion, then, we start seeing most Americans shift their emphasis from that kind of we need to promote liberty mentality, where we want to have as little government as possible, to suddenly thinking we need a stronger, more powerful nation that can actually implement order, that can prevent things like rebellions from occurring in the future. So this leads us to the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787. At this convention, we are going to create a new form of government. Essentially, what we're going to see is that instead of amending the articles, most of the delegates there will assume that the articles are really too broken and too weak to fix, and they are going to implement a new form of government called the U.S. Constitution. Now, because we are changing governments, I think it's important to talk about the people who were doing this process. Today, the U.S. touts itself as a massive democracy, which is a little bit inaccurate because we're not a true democracy. In a true democracy, every American would vote for everything. And instead, we actually elect people to represent us in government. We have what we call a republic system, where you and I go out and vote on election day to then have people represent us in, say, Congress or the presidency or as a judge or something like that. So we're not a perfect democracy. But most Americans hold things like democracy very close and very, very much important as part of their lives. And so our question then is well, was the Philadelphia Convention truly that democratic? Was it really that cradle of democracy most Americans envision it to be? And I would argue the answer is no. Because if we look at the convention, we realize pretty quickly that the folks there do not represent most Americans. So when we talk about the backgrounds of delegates, we are dealing with people who are elites. Most of these folks were born into wealthy families. So you have people like George Washington, who was a very rich man, whose family was rich, and he is going to be representing Americans at this convention. If you have people who were not born rich, they had often married well enough to become elites. So we're talking about people like Alexander Hamilton. I know a lot of us are watching the musical more recently, and Hamilton was born very poor, but he made a very good marriage, and as a result, he attained a social status that was very on par with being an elite. And so the folks who are there then do not represent most of America when it comes to social class. Most Americans are middle or lower class, and the idea that this is a room full of elites suggests that this does not represent America. We also know that these folks are much more highly educated than your standard everyday American. A lot of Americans in this time period can't read, and those that do tend to do so at kind of a very basic level. But when we look around the room when it comes to the Philadelphia Convention, almost all of these folks are college educated, meaning they went to places like Princeton and Harvard and Yale and got really, really good high power educations. And so these folks are the smart guys. These are the guys who have kind of the intellectual background. And in fact, about 2/3 of these folks are lawyers. So they are not only familiar with education, but they're also familiar with legal systems. So very different again than most Americans. We also know that this group is not very diverse because there is no recognition for things like race or gender. There are going to be no people of color in this convention, and in fact, about 1/3 of the delegates who go are actually slave owners who are vested in keeping that racial hierarchy in place. So there's no recognition of that. There's also no women, because women are not going to be considered kind of political actors until the 20th century. And so you don't see women at this convention either. And so if we look at it, it's very white, it's very male, it's very rich, and a lot of it tends to be very old because a lot of these folks are older statesmen. And that just isn't what most Americans are. So based on background alone, it's not a very democratic assembly. It's not very representative of most of the US. We also have some problems when it comes to democracy because we're missing people. A lot of times when I give this lecture, I'll ask, well, who do you think should be here? And people will say, well, like George Washington, he was the hero, right, of the Revolution. Washington is at this convention, as is a very old Benjamin Franklin. But there are also some folks that we would normally associate with kind of this fight that are not there. So people like John Adams, who was a massive player in the events leading between the kind of protests of the Stamp Act all the way through things like the First and Second Continental Congress. And yet he is not going to be there. Adams is actually serving as an ambassador to Great Britain, trying to convince the British to remove their forts in the West. He's not there at the Constitutional Convention to put his ideas into practice. You also have people like Thomas Jefferson not being there. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was the one that declared things like all men are created equal. And of course, we know that he was a little off when he said that because he truly meant all white men rather than all mankind or even just all men regardless of race. But the idea is when we think about founding documents, things that define American and what it means to be a country and a society, Jefferson's ideas are the ones that we remember. They are the ones we talk about. And yet he's not at this convention either. Jefferson is in France dealing with trying to convince the French that, hey, the Americans will pay you back eventually, don't get too upset. So he's not there either. And both of these men, by the way, served on the same committee that wrote that declaration. And so a lot of people are saying, well, why are these folks not here? Well, they're busy doing other things. And so a lot of people, when they assess kind of who's there, say, well, these folks should have been there if we're truly holding up their ideas. If those are going to be some of the things that are influencing what we're doing, these folks should be here. Another thing that suggests that we're not necessarily doing maybe the thing that's the most on the up and up is that not all of the states sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention. Only 12 of the 13 states actually agree to participate. And the reason for this is that you have some states who are afraid of losing their current power. The state that did not attend is actually Rhode Island. And Rhode Island, as many of us know, is very, very small, has a very small amount of population, also has this very small geographic landmass. And under the current article system, every state gets one vote, which means Rhode Island is just as powerful as, say, a bigger state like Virginia or New York that has a lot of people and a lot of landmass. And they were very afraid that if you changed the system, they would lose out and they would lose power. And so they figured, well, if we don't go, you can't amend the articles because you won't have 13 states agree. But a lot of people say, well, if you can't get all 13 states in a room, and this is supposed to be your new government, is that really democratic? Is that really a good way to do things? And that's kind of questionable. Because here's the reality. The process of creating the Constitution is akin to a political coup. So C-O-U-P is pronounced coup. And when we hear the word coup, it means that inside your government you have someone toppling it. So what I mean is, a lot of times when we talk about countries and we talk about coups, you're going to have a segment of the country overthrow the government you have in place, and they tend to do it from within. That's what the Founding Fathers are doing when they wrote the Constitution. When they decided to write a constitution and get rid of the articles, they were staging a coup. And coups are not something that are generally seen as positive. Normally, when we talk about coups in history, we talk about the negative effects. We talk about how it's kind of unlawful to do that. And the Founding Fathers knew that what they were doing was not exactly on the up and up, because when they met in Philadelphia in the summer, so this is hot, this is in a time period before air conditioning and electricity exist, they are meeting in a room that has the windows nailed shut. They don't want people hearing what they're doing, because they understand that overthrowing the government is essentially akin to treason. It's kind of what it is. And so just imagine for a second, you're so committed to what you're doing, but you also know that it's wrong, that you're sitting in a stifling hot room in the middle of Philadelphia in July when everybody wears wool clothing and deodorant has not been invented. Some of you are going, oh my gosh, that is a terrible mental image. That's my point. And yet the Founding Fathers were adamant that you keep those windows closed because you don't want to risk people hearing what you're doing, because again, not on the up and up. So keep that in mind. The other reason we know that the Founding Fathers understood that what they were doing was a little bit outside the law was because they decided that whatever they did, the people were going to have to support it. Meaning the people were going to have a vote or talk about it or be involved some way in agreeing to the new government. Because if we believe in ideas like the social contract, right, that the people have to give up rights so that the government has power, we have to actually get the people to agree to this government. The people had agreed to the Articles, they now need to agree to the Constitution. But again, this is an indicator that this was not exactly the most democratic thing, otherwise the people would have been involved from the start. So, the point I'm making is for this being the so-called cradle of democracy, it's not very democratic. It's not very representative of Americans. The other thing you want to understand about the Philadelphia Convention is that it is full of disputes. Everyone who was in that room for the most part agreed that we did need to change the Articles, that they were too weak, and that they were never going to produce an effective government in the U.S. But that does not mean that they all agree on how that process should work or what sort of things the new government should emphasize. And so from the beginning, there are going to be some major disputes that pop up amongst our delegates. So one of these is going to be a fight over, well, how strong should the government be? Should we emphasize a lot of order and go and be like a monarchy? So Alexander Hamilton, for instance, actually proposed that the U.S. have a king and have a monarchy. Most people were going, dude, that's a little bit much. But there were people advocating for a very strong government so that you could prevent things like Shays' Rebellion from happening. Other people are more towards the liberty end, where they agree that we need something stronger than what we have with the Articles, but they don't want it to be too much stronger or it risks looking too much like the British. And so both sides are going to be kind of demanding that their views get heard. Either you want a super strong government or you want a somewhat stronger but not really strong government. It's going to be a toss-up. And so you have to kind of figure out, well, how do you navigate that and make people happy, make people able to deal with a government that's somewhere between that hardcore monarchy that someone like Hamilton is advocating and that super weak government that people who like the Articles wanted. Another thing we're going to fight over is things like state size and how much power each of the states will have. So we know that based on everybody in attendance that there are both big states and small states. So by big states, I'm talking about big geographically, big in population. So places like Virginia. Small states would be places like Delaware or New Jersey, who have smaller land masses, smaller populations. These two entities are going to be fighting it out because they're worried about how much power they're going to have in the new government. Big states argue they're bigger, they have more people, they should have more power. And so they will actually introduce what we call the Virginia Plan, which was a plan designed to recognize that big states deserve more power in government. So according to the Virginia Plan, you are going to have a two-house system, so a two-house Congress, and that you would have that designed based on population. So states with more people would have more representatives. Well, this really bothered the small states who were saying, but, well, if you do that, our voices are not going to be heard. So they counter with things like the New Jersey plan that says, well, we want a one-house Congress where every state gets one vote. Basically, it's the same as what we have under the Articles. And so the two different sides of states are both arguing back and forth, saying, I deserve more power, no, I deserve the same power, and so on and so forth. And so making both sides happy is going to require figuring out how to kind of maneuver between the two ideas. Another thing that's going to be fought over pretty extensively is slavery. Now, understand every single American colony did have slaves, but following the American Revolution, views about slavery start to shift. So some colonies, or now states as they're now in terms of level, some states decided that the idea of slavery conflicted with ideas like the Declaration of Independence and the values of the Revolution. If you're going to say things like, you fought for liberty against the British, well, slavery is the opposite of liberty. It's, forced control. And so a lot of these northern areas, so places like Rhode Island or Massachusetts or New Jersey, are going to decide to phase out slavery over time. Now, this is not immediate where they just sign a bill and say we end slavery. Most of the time what it is adult slaves will stay slaves, but then their kids, once they reach a certain age, will be granted their freedom. Typically it's around the age of about 14, sometimes as high as 18. But the point being is in the next few generations, most of those northern states will phase out slavery. In other states, it's not so clear cut. So places like Virginia, for instance, are going to say, well, we see the conflict in the whole principle of the Revolution and slavery. And so they will do things like make it easier to free your slaves. So like Thomas Jefferson is part of the Virginia legislature. Again, Thomas Jefferson is kind of a ironic guy. He will actually make it easier to manumit. Manumit's the fancy way of saying free your slaves. So he'll take away a lot of the restrictions. He'll make it easier. So this is kind of a recognition that he and other Virginians were like, well, we remember what we said in the Declaration, but at the same time, we also are kind of hesitant to go out and end slavery because it's a big part of the economy. And then you have the third group, which is the really deep South states. And their argument is that they need slavery for their economy and that they don't see a contradiction between slavery and freedom. Because from their point of view, if you're talking about ideas like liberty, that applies to whites. And they would argue that they actually appreciate their freedom more because they can contrast it with something like slavery. And so what we're seeing is by the time that the Constitutional Convention rolls around, a portion of the nation is committed to getting rid of slavery, and another portion is pretty committed to keeping slavery. And that is going to lead to fights, especially as we start talking about things like representation. Southern states are going to argue that slaves should be counted as part of their population base, meaning you don't just count the white people to determine political power, you also count your slaves, because technically they are humans. Other states, though, particularly the northern states, are saying that doesn't exactly work, because in all other instances, slaves are treated as property. And so property is not people under the law. And so they're saying if you're going to treat your slaves as property, you can't count them for representation. However, because they are property, the Northerners believe the South should pay more taxes because we tax property. And the South says, no, you can't do that. You can't tax us more. It's unfair. And so you're going to see those fights over representation and taxation when it comes to slavery. How do you count slaves? Do you consider them as people for the portions of population, or do you only consider them property and tax them more? That's where the debate is going. Now, to actually address this debate, we are going to hand the writing of the Constitution over to James Madison, who will get quite a bit of help from Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton himself is always getting involved in things. And so he will be kind of the sidekick to James Madison. And as part of writing the Constitution, these two men understand that you're going to have to balance these disputes. You are going to essentially come up with compromises. So what I want you to understand about the Constitution is that from its inception, it is a document based on compromise. That every side in that particular dispute had to give up a little bit so that we could actually get a government that encompassed all of the U.S. and was going to work, it was going to function. Again, we're not talking about a perfect government. I will never argue that the Constitution is perfect. The fact that it will eventually be amended many times suggests that the Constitution has had to change and evolve over time. But the point I'm trying to convey is from the start, compromise is a key part of the political system. Both sides have to be willing to give up a little bit to be able to implement something that will actually work and function. And so Madison, again with some assistance from Hamilton, will be the guy to do that. So if I ever ask you who wrote the Constitution, please write James Madison. Now, underline star the next part. Do not ever write that Thomas Jefferson created the Constitution. Jefferson was not even at the convention. So please don't put that down. A lot of Americans mistakenly believe that Jefferson wrote both documents. He did not. Jefferson wrote the Declaration. Madison, with help from Hamilton, wrote the Constitution. Please keep that in mind. All right. With that said, let's talk about the compromises that Madison is going to put into the document. The first one we'll start with is that fear of a strong government, meaning a lot of people were afraid that the government was going to become too much like the British and become too tyrannical. And so Madison says we're not going to do that because of the big structure of government. So Madison, as part of this, is going to create what we call a federal system. Federal just means that there is a division of power between the national government and the state and local governments. So in our American system, the federal government is not the only government that we possess. It is also not the only people who exert power and control over the citizens. Underneath the federal government, we also have state governments, and of course we have county and city governments as well. And so that's what we mean with the federal system, is that you're going to have different levels of government sharing power. And the idea is if the federal government has particular rights, and the state and the county and the local governments have particular rights, that is going to prevent either one of those groups from becoming too powerful and taking away the rights of the other. So he's balancing out, saying some power goes to the national, some power goes to the state and local. We are also, within the national government, going to divide power into 3 branches. So we're going to have the executive branch, that's the president and his cabinet. They enforce the laws. Then you're going to have Congress that makes the laws. And then you're going to have the Supreme Court, who will interpret the laws and make decisions about legal ideas within the U.S. And the reason Madison broke these up into different branches is because if you have 3 different branches, it makes it hard for any one group to control all parts of the federal government. By having each group do different things, each branch have different powers, no one entity can control them all. And so that keeps them from working as a cohesive block to destroy people's rights. And Madison was doing that on purpose, okay? He is also going to create a system of checks and balances. So not only do we divide the power amongst different groups, but we also give each branch of the government the ability to check the others. And the idea is if one group or one branch of the government becomes tyrannical, the other 2 can step in and stop it. So let me explain kind of how checks and balances works. So some of you know that the legislative branch, Congress, is the one that makes the laws. Before those laws can go into effect, however, they have to be sent to the president for him to sign them. If he agrees with the law, he puts his signature on it, and that law becomes operational. If, however, the president disagrees, he's able to veto the law, meaning he says, I'm not going to approve it, I'm not going to sign it, and he sends it back to the legislature for them to kind of try again. And so it keeps the legislature from passing bad laws. In another instance, we'll have people like, let's say the president screws up. The president does something really, really bad. Well, then Congress has the right to do things like go through the impeachment process, where they can actually vote to decide if he's broken any laws or done anything bad, and then they can try him. And if he's found guilty, then he can actually be removed from office. And you can do that with people in any of these branches. So you can do that for the president, you can do that for the Supreme Court, you can do that for people in the federal positions. And so giving Congress the power to impeach means that they can check and make sure that the other ones are not doing things that are problematic. And then, of course, the Supreme Court can do that as well. So let's say you have a bad law passed by Congress, signed by the president, and then somebody says, well, this is a bad law. Well, then they take it to the Supreme Court, who decides, does it meet the spirit of the Constitution or not? If it doesn't, then they actually get rid of it, and a Supreme Court ruling has the force of law. So if it's a bad law and they remove it, that law basically never existed. It goes away. And so all of these branches have particular powers, and they have the ability to check the powers of the other. And so again, it prevents any one entity from becoming too powerful, and from all three entities in the federal government from working together to be tyrannical. All right, let's move on to the issues with state size. We're going to use Congress specifically to deal with state size. Because both big states and small states had particular views, Madison decides that the best option to use is to actually give Congress two houses. The first house will be decided based on proportion. So we're going to use population to decide how many representatives you have in the House. So if you are a bigger state with bigger population, you are going to have more people in the House of Representatives. So like today, the two biggest and most populous states are California and Texas, and they have the most representatives in the House of Representatives, okay? So big states have more, small states have less. So this is kind of a nod to the Virginia plan. On the other side of it, though, the Senate will have equal representation. So this is a nod to the small state New Jersey plan, right? And so what I mean is every state in the Senate has the exact same number of votes. In this case, every state has 2 senators. So they have 2 votes. And so the idea is this means that little states like Rhode Island or New Jersey can't be completely taken over by the big states. And so they get a voice in government. And because the Senate is actually the more powerful house, they have a pretty good say. Okay? So we broke up the problems of state size. We made the House proportional based on population. We made the Senate based on equal representation. Then we need to balance things like fears of the people. So the idea that you give too many people too many rights, too much liberty, they rebel. Madison is going to do this in a couple of ways. First, he is going to allow the people a say in government because he will allow the House to be directly elected. So when you go to the polls in November, you get to vote for who represents you in the House of Representatives during this time period, okay? And so you, the people, have a say. However, Madison is afraid that the people, if they have too much of a say, could elect bad leaders. So he decides to make the Senate appointed. Now, I understand that today you vote for senators, but that is a modern thing. You do not actually get to vote for senators until late in the 1900s. When we first start seeing senators were actually appointed by the legislatures of their states. So through the 1800s, for instance, if, let's say, Texas was going to have senators, well, the Texas legislature would elect the 2 senators. And the idea being is if you have the states appoint them, if you have the states send them to the national government, it's going to put a kind of middle group in between the people and the Senate. So you're going to have the people vote for the state legislature, and the state legislature select the people to go to the Senate. The idea being is that that state legislature is going to be kind of a group. They can decide if the people are acting crazy, and they can avoid appointing bad leaders. So the people get to vote directly for the House, but the Senate is going to be appointed by state legislatures until more modern times. And so we're not giving them too much of a say on things. And we're going to do the same thing with the president. So every year when we go for president, we have 2 votes. The first one is what you and I do when we go cast our vote. That's called the popular vote or the popular election, where we go out and we decide who we're going to vote for. So in the most recent election, people went out and decided, did you want to vote for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, right? And so the people got to decide that. That, however, does not determine who the president is. Instead, the Electoral College determines who the president is. The idea is when the Electoral College meets, they, at this time period, did not have to vote for whoever won the popular vote in their state. They could vote for whoever they wanted. And so the idea is that if the people decided to elect someone crazy, that the Electoral College could come in, step in, and shut that down. That they could just pick someone else instead. And that would prevent, really bad leaders from taking office. And so in the time period, that works fairly well. I will say that in the modern time period, the Electoral College, because most states have demanded that if a person wins the popular vote, that they then get the electoral votes, doesn't work as it was intended to in this time period. But this was kind of the principle behind it. People like Madison and Hamilton were afraid that the people might pick bad leaders. The Electoral College was supposed to kind of come in and prevent that from happening. It doesn't really do that much now today because, again, of state laws, but that was the intent when it was created. Finally, we're going to make some compromises on slavery. And I know this actually freaks out some people, but slavery is actually woven into the fabric of the Constitution from the very beginning. And I know right now, as the U.S. is coming to grips with a lot of the histories of racism in America, that this topic is becoming a little bit more widely spread and a little bit more widely understood. But slavery itself was woven into the fabric of the Constitution from the get-go. Now, we never actually used the word slave. Instead, we use the words persons held to service or labor. And the reason we don't use the word slave is even when this document was created in the 1780s, words like slave were starting to be seen as kind of problematic. Slave and slavery are seen as bad things by a lot of people. And so a lot of folks, when they wrote the Constitution, didn't necessarily want to frame it in a word that seemed so negative. And so Madison used that euphemism, persons held to service or labor, because it's hinting that you could also include groups like indentured servants. Now, based on what we learned in the colonial period, we don't have a whole lot of indentured servants in America anymore. So when he said persons held to service or labor, he really meant slaves. But he was trying to kind of avoid that language just so that it didn't make people angry. Again, I am calling it what it is. It's a reference to slavery, but that's the word he used. And in fact, we don't actually use the word slave or slavery until we abolish it in the 13th Amendment at the end of this course. But I just want you to know that if you ever see those words, persons held to service or labor, he does refer to slavery. Now, as part of putting it in the Constitution, we're going to see that in 3 places. The first is what we call the 3/5 Compromise. This deals with the issue of taxation and representation. Madison understood that these were very, very heavily debated topics, where both sides were not really willing to give a whole lot. And so what he decides to do is give each side a little bit of what they want. So the South wanted to count slaves as part of their population for things like the Electoral College and things like the House of Representatives. And so what Madison says is that we'll count every slave as 3/5 of a person. Now some of you are going, how can someone count as 3/5 of a person? What they did is they just count up all the slaves, and then they count 3/5 of that amount. So if you have 100 slaves, you would then count 60 of them for the purposes of representation. Okay, so you get to add that to your white population to determine your representatives in Congress. Now, does that mean that slaves are any part of a person of the law? No. Only for purposes of representation. According to the way the South defines slaves, they define them as property, not people. And so legally in the South, slaves are not considered people. It's only for this one issue of representation. Now, the other part of this compromise is that because the North wanted the South to pay more taxes, that's going to come true. The South will have to pay more taxes as a kind of exchange. So they'll get more political power, but they do have to pay more taxes. That was the trade-off. Okay? All right, next place we put in slavery is what we call the fugitive slave clause. It's usually just a fugitive clause because it doesn't use the word slave, but the principle is there. When we talk about this is for slave owners who were very afraid because part of the nation was now becoming free and the other part was slave. A lot of the folks in that nation were very afraid that if slaves ran away to the North, that they would automatically get their freedom and that Southerners would lose their money because slaves are considered property. And so Madison, who, yes, is a slave owner, decided to put this into the Constitution that said that even if a slave runs away to a free area, he's still a slave. And it gives the Southerners the right to go and collect their quote-unquote property wherever they may run to. So if a slave runs away to New York, for instance, and a Southerner wants to go, say, from Virginia to New York to get their slave, they have the right to do that. This also applies to indentured servants, but again, we know there are not a whole lot of those, so it's really about slaves. Finally, and this is the last one, we are going to prohibit the U.S. from banning involvement in the international slave trade. So by this point in history, some countries were very, very against the international slave trade because of things like the horrors of the Middle Passage. And so people like Britain were actually starting to kind of get rid of, or at least try to end the involvement with the international slave trade. Same thing with France. The U.S., however, really wanted to be able to have access to cheap slaves. Slaves that are imported from Africa are actually cheaper than native-born slaves. And so a lot of folks who wanted to become slave owners wanted access to slaves. And so as part of this, Madison declares that the U.S. will not end its involvement with the international slave trade for 20 years. So it's 20 years for people to bring in as many slaves as they want. And then after that, the U.S. government can end involvement in the trade if they want. And that's exactly what's going to happen. The 20-year mark will actually be 1808. Thomas Jefferson will be president, and he will actually end our involvement in the international slave trade. But for 20 years, it keeps Southern slave owners happy. They can import more slaves. And so that was kind of a nod to their kind of views about the topic. Now, again, I'm not saying any of these things are good things. When we talk about slavery, we know with morality that this does not match the morality of 2020 or any time after, a particular point in history. We start talking about slavery, right? Slavery is something that most of us imagine in our mind that it's not a good thing, right? It's a bad thing. And so understand when we're having this conversation, again, this was not necessarily a conversation about morality. And it's unfortunate that these phrases were inserted into the Constitution, but at least you understand that it was Madison's attempt to kind of filter a compromise. Again, the way most of us wish that it had worked is that these phrases were never put into the Constitution, but they were, and we have to understand that. Now, obviously, when we end slavery, these things become null and void and are no longer in face. But unfortunately, it takes us until the end of this class in 1865 to do that. I'm just kind of drawing your attention to it because it's important that we consider it. Okay? All right. With all of these compromises put in place, when we talk about the power of the U.S. Constitution, it tends to sit kind of in the middle of what the British had and the Articles. So Madison basically took the two systems, the two things people were advocating, either really powerful government or really weak government, and kind of split the difference and put it in the middle. So is the U.S. Constitution much stronger than the Articles? Absolutely. Is it as strong as the British? No, not anywhere close. It's somewhere in the middle, and that's what made most people kind of happy about the situation. They saw that as about the right place to put it. Now, because the document has been written, and because the Founding Fathers did want the people's input, they decided that before the Constitution could become operational, we had to go through a process that we call ratification. Ratification is a fancy way of saying we had to approve it. That the people themselves had to go through the process of saying this is the government that they wanted to have put in place. And so to do this, we create a process for ratification. So the first step in this process is that we actually need specially elected conventions. So what we're telling every state is that you need to hold an election. And then at this election, the people will vote to send delegates to a convention. And then that convention will read the document and decide if they like the Constitution or not. So, is it full-on democracy? No. Had it been full-on democracy, the people themselves would have been able to go out and read the document and vote directly on it. So, it's not really democratic. But do they at least get a say by selecting the delegate to go? Yes, they do. Once these conventions are held, we decide that 9 of the 13 states must ratify the document for it to go into effect. Now, why 9 of 13? Because that was the exact same number we had to have legislation passed under the Articles. And we understood that most Americans would agree to that number, that they would respect a 9 out of 13 vote. And in fact, eventually, all 13 states will ratify it. But we just needed 9 to begin with, okay? Because we figured that would be the number most Americans would accept. We also decide that of those 9 states, 2 of them have to be Virginia and New York. The reason New York is so important is New York is the biggest, and New York has been where the national capital has been sitting since the Revolution. So that is really important that New York does it, because if they don't, most Americans are not going to accept the Constitution. Virginia is the oldest state. We know it was the first colony, and it is also one of the biggest. It is pretty much the second biggest state. And so many people assumed if the oldest state didn't actually support the Constitution, then it would probably not be good for the whole thing. Most people said if Virginia didn't accept it, why should we? Okay? So those two states were crucial. Okay? Ironically, these are also the two states that Madison and Hamilton happen to be from. Madison is from Virginia. Hamilton is from New York. It also happens to be one southern state and one northern state. But it was really more based on population and based on age of the state. But just things to point out. Now, despite all of this, understand that not everybody was in love with the new Constitution. In fact, there are a group of people called the Anti-Federalists. They get their name because the Constitution created a federal system. So if you oppose the Constitution, you oppose a federal system. So they are the Anti-Federalists, who did not agree with what had gone down in Philadelphia. So these include people like Patrick Henry, who was a major force in the actual revolution. Patrick Henry is kind of the leading guy, the give me liberty, give me death guy. And he was really, thought of himself as kind of a man of the people. And most people really respected him. And so he was invited to go to the Philadelphia Convention, but he refused because he had a feeling they were going to overthrow the Articles. As he put it, he smelled a rat. And he didn't want to be a part of a political coup. And when the Constitution is presented to the people, he believes that it's really bad because he believes that it doesn't protect the people's rights. There's nothing like a Bill of Rights to guarantee that the average American citizen has rights under this new government. He was very afraid of that. He will be joined in this opposition by folks like George Mason and Richard Henry Lee, who, in addition to hating the lack of protections, the fact that there's no Bill of Rights, will also question if this system is going to work in a nation the size of the U.S. So they tend to look at the U.S. and say, because the U.S. is so big and because the capital right now is in New York, the people in the national government are going to struggle to be able to enforce their views in, say, way off in the middle of maybe Mississippi, which is, very far away. And so according to these three men, it might be better just to have a regular state-emphasized government because the states are closer to the people. They're going to be able to enforce laws. They're going to be able to do things like collect taxes. They're going to be the ones who should be in charge. And so they disagree with the Constitution putting most of the power in the federal government. Finally, they also basically suggest that this is akin to tyranny, that this government is just too strong. That because it stresses so much power in the federal government, and because it doesn't have that Bill of Rights, that it looks too much like the British, and they're just not all on board for that. So the Anti-Federalists hate the document. Now, for as many people who hate the document, there are also going to be people who do. So the people who do support the Constitution are called the Federalists. These are people who like the federal system. That's where they get their name. Now, some of the folks who support the Constitution really won't be a shock, right? So, like James Madison supporting the Constitution is not exactly a shock. He wrote the sucker. Alexander Hamilton helped him write the document, and we know he's a big fan of a stronger government, so it's not really a shock that he supports it. But they're also going to be joined by folks like John Jay and even George Washington. The reason I point out these three guys, though, is that they understand that when the Anti-Federalists, particularly people like Patrick Henry, who's very popular, start criticizing the document, they're afraid that if they keep criticizing it, that the Federalists will not be able to get the document ratified. And so these three men are actually going to band together, and they're going to write what we call the Federalist Papers. This is a bunch of essays that actually talk about why the Constitution is so amazing. And of course, they're edited or authored by these three guys. Hamilton wrote most of them, followed by Madison, and then Jay wrote a few. But each of these essays talked about something that was good in the Constitution that would help the U.S. And so a lot of them stress things like this government can't be tyrannical And so they talk about like the separation of powers, and they talk about the checks and balance systems, and they talk about the different branches of government and how it's really hard to have one particular group dominate the federal government, or how if the federal government and the state governments share power, then the federal government can't become tyrannical. They also do things like talk about how the US is really big. And while the Anti-Federalists saw that as a negative, the Federalists saw the size of the US as actually amazing. Because if you have a nation that's super big, then you're going to have a lot of different ideas in that nation. And that means you're going to have different groups and different political needs. And it's going to be hard for any one group to control anything. The more ideas you have in a room, the less likely that one of them is going to dominate the others. And that's kind of the thing they were going for. Finally, they kind of went with, well, if nothing else, we need a stronger government. And you Anti-Federalists are like, you hate the Constitution. But where's your substitute? Where's your other option? And so the Federalists say, hey, even if this doesn't work out perfectly, at least it's better than what we got, right? And so those are the arguments the two sides are making. Now, I will tell you from the get-go, because we get the Constitution, that the Federalists win. But we want to talk about the reasons that they win. They win for multiple reasons. For one, they win because they just needed to fix the They needed to fix the Articles. The Articles were problematic. So they needed something stronger. So the idea that they're going to demand, something stronger, even if it's not perfect. And by the way, the Constitution is by no means perfect, but at least it's better than what they had. Well, then it makes sense, right? And so that's going to convince a lot of people. The fact that dear old George Washington, who most Americans love and respect for his, success with the Constitution, is going to support it, is another reason that the Federalists are going to get it passed. But finally, the Federalists are practical. And so when Patrick Henry says, you don't have a Bill of Rights, fine. They said, we can fix that. We can add a Bill of Rights. And so what people like Madison and Hamilton promise is that if you want a Bill of Rights that badly, ratify the Constitution, and then we will take submissions for amendments. We promise we will put that in. Now, today, if a politician promises you something, I'm curious, do you believe them? Because I'm a cynic, I'm a skeptic, and I know that a lot of you guys are skeptics. And so we tend to think that politicians and lying kind of go hand in hand. And so most people today, that if you promise you're going to do something, don't always believe a politician. But you're forgetting the time period. Today, we're all cynics and skeptics. But back then, the highest thing a person had, whether you were rich or poor, was your word. If you promised to do something and didn't, no one in society respected you. So when somebody said, I promise to give you a Bill of Rights, like Madison is saying, I promise you will get a Bill of Rights if you ratify this, most Americans say, well, there's no way he wouldn't keep his promise. So if you promise to do it, we respect it, we're okay with that. And so the promise of a Bill of Rights is what's going to finally kind of push everybody over the mark and say, we will ratify it. So you will get not only the 9 of 13, but eventually all 13 states will ratify the Constitution. Okay? All right. With the Constitution ratified, I want to talk about some things about this document. Because the Constitution is the most important document in American legal sense. It defines all of our rights. It defines how the country operates. It defines the way society is set up. But I want you to understand, again, that the Constitution was not perfect when it was written. In fact, it is a document that has had to evolve over time. Meaning, as life has progressed in the U.S., we have found things that have been missing in that document that we've had to add, or we've had to change the meaning, or we've had to alter so that we get a society that better meets the current needs. And so I want to talk about some of the issues that are in this Constitution, some of the weaknesses, and some of the things we need to add. One of the first things we need to add is a Bill of Rights. Madison and Hamilton promised you'd get a Bill of Rights. And for once, politicians really came through with their promises. Because in the year after the Constitution was ratified, Madison said, if you've got an amendment, send it to me. And so they literally got hundreds upon hundreds of submissions, and they weeded through all of them, he and a couple of other folks, and they came up with what they thought would be 12 amendments that would really be good. They then submitted those amendments to the states, and we selected 10 of them. And so those 10 that were endorsed by the people became the first 10 amendments, or what we call the Bill of Rights. Typically, we think of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution as the things that define Americans' rights in society. So these are things like the right, like the First Amendment with the freedom of speech and the right to assemble and the freedom of the presses, freedom of religion. We also think about things like the Second Amendment with the right to bear arms, or the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, or all of those things. All of those rights are fundamental. And by the way, you as an American or as someone who lives in the United States, if you're going to ever worry about, what your rights are and protected, you need to understand the Bill of Rights, because they are the things that protect you, not only in society, but also if you were to ever, for whatever reason, run afoul of the law. So you want to know things like the Fourth Amendment, which protects you against unlawful search and seizures. You have the right to demand, if someone is searching your property, what their probable cause is, or where their warrant is, before you have to let them into your home. Those are important things, and I'm not saying any of us would ever run afoul of the law, but it's important things to know, just like things like the freedom of speech. Those are things we hold near and dear. They're in your Bill of Rights. You want to know them. So, Madison and Hamilton do actually fulfill this promise. We do get a Bill of Rights. That's our first 10 amendments. In other instances, we're going to have to deal with some vague guidelines. The Constitution, despite being a good document, is kind of vague on a lot of things. And so sometimes you have to go through additional steps to fill in those kind of vague guidelines. Good example is the president's cabinet. According to the Constitution, the president has the right to have advisors to help him make decisions, to advise him on how to handle things. But the Constitution was not really clear about how he got those advisors. Were they going to be elected? Were they going to be appointed? We don't really know. What we do know is that when George Washington, who everybody, by the way, knew was going to be the first president, they knew that pretty much from the beginning, but when Washington takes office as the first president, he's going to actually come in and say, well, I want a cabinet. And so he's going to come in and he's going to appoint 3 different folks. First, for Secretary of State, he appoints Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, has got some experience with being an ambassador to France. He's also really good with political ideas, including English political ideas, because, again, we plagiarize Locke quite a bit. And so he's going to be his choice to help interact with other nations. We also know that we need to do something like deal with the economy, so we're going to set up a national treasury, and we're going to make the Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's a really good numbers guy. He's really good with money. So we're going to make him secretary. And then we're going to have a Secretary of War, because we're probably going to have conflicts, we know, because of problems with the Native Americans as well as problems with the British and French and Spanish, that we may end up having to go to war. And so we'll appoint people like Henry Knox, Secretary of War. Now, when he appointed these folks, people didn't know how this was going to work, but Washington basically said, if I appoint these folks and have the Senate agree to them, is that good enough? And everybody said, yeah, that sounds pretty good. I mean, you appoint them, the Senate gets to say if they're good people or not. That sounds fair. That sounds like it's not too powerful. Sounds like you're going to pick good people, because if not, we can keep you from having them. We're going to go with that. So Washington kind of came in through action and fulfilled those kind of vague guidelines. All right. Now we have to talk about other things, though, because despite the idea that we could address the Constitution, we could amend it, and despite the idea that we can fill in some of these guidelines, there are going to be things that the Constitution cannot settle. There are going to be folks, for instance, who are excluded from the Constitution that it will take many, many years to incorporate them, okay? So one of the big ones that we're going to talk about when it comes to exclusions is obviously different people. So we know when the Constitution was written, when we talk about we the people, people was defined as white males. It will take time to get in people of color. So for instance, it won't be until we get to the second half of U.S. history, which happens after 1865, that we talk about ideas like the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment, or the citizenship for all men, regardless of race, that are born or naturalized in the U.S. That's the 14th Amendment. Those will take time to fill in. We also will have to fill in groups like women. Women won't get the right to vote till the 19th Amendment in 1920. Those are going to be exclusions that are problematic that will have to be filled in over time. And of course, today the U.S. is also having conversations about the rights of other groups within society, including the LGBTQ plus community as an example. So there are still going to be exclusions within that document that don't perfectly address all Americans. Those will take time and change to, alter over time, which is why we get more amendments going forward. It also does not completely get rid of the dispute over things like order versus liberty. The Constitution is a good document, but depending on how you read that document depends on how much power the federal government has or not. If you think that the document is something like a guideline, there's going to be more potential to come in and exert power. If you read the document as a word-for-word thing, there's going to be less. But it's not a perfect consideration of things like how much order, how much liberty we are going to have. It's a set of guidelines, and depending on who's in office, there might be more emphasis on order or more emphasis on liberty. It depends on the people occupying the White House and occupying the Capitol building and occupying the Supreme Court for us to figure that out. Also realize that the Constitution is a document, and like any other document, it is subject to interpretation. And so, depending on who's reading it, you're going to get a different view of things. And we haven't agreed on how we should read this. So should this be guidelines or should this be a word-for-word document? We don't know yet. That's going to require the folks going forward and how they interpret it to determine what that means for the U.S. But we'll talk about that next time when we talk about Washington's presidency and the first few folks to kind of come in and try to form a functioning government in the U.S. So we now have the Constitution, it's operational, but how people put it into practice determines more about what happens next. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. Bye for now.